Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, what are counting rituals in obsessive-compulsive disorder? So when we talk about counting rituals in OCD, a lot of times what we're talking about is a type of obsession and compulsion related to checking. So an individual will count something so many times in order to check it. A lot of times these checking obsessions and compulsions are tied to safety. Now when we think about OCD, of course we think about the two parts, obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions increase anxiety, and compulsions in theory decrease anxiety. Now in certain presentations, sometimes OCD appears to only have obsessions. But really if we look more closely at those presentations, we see that it's a mental compulsion that's occurring as opposed to a regular compulsion, a compulsion that would be observable to somebody on the outside. So with these mental compulsions, we also have counting rituals. So counting rituals can be a mental compulsion, a regular compulsion, and of course there's an obsession component to them as well. So what types of obsessions and compulsions do we see with counting rituals? Well, as I mentioned, a lot of times they're centered around safety. So we see objects like light switches, for example. A light switch will be turned on and off so many times, a particular number of times. Or the individual will push down on the light switch so many times. We also can look at other types of switches as well. For example, with light switches, some light switches are dimmer switches. So here you might see somebody turning the dimmer all the way down to all the way up, left or right or up and down depending on how the switch is configured. And we can see this with switches on electronic devices too. So sometimes it's turning them on and off, and sometimes it's just making sure they're in a certain position. Similarly with counting rituals, we see this with locks. Oftentimes we think of this as the lock on a door to a house, but it can be a car, shed, filing cabinet, really anything that has a lock. So again, sometimes the lock is just checked, like for example with a padlock. Someone just pull on the padlock and make sure that it's locked, and they might do this so many times. And sometimes the lock is unlocked and locked so many times. We usually think of this with something like a deadbolt lock on a door. Another area we see counting rituals with safety is with ovens and other appliances. So if an oven is electric or gas, the burner can be turned on and off so many times. And again, this is to make sure it's actually off. So we could see this where somebody just pushes it in the off position so many times as well. Now some of the counting rituals are not as clearly tied to safety. They're not as obviously oriented toward safety. For example, having to walk in and out of a room so many times before somebody walks out of the room for the final time. So you might see somebody that has to cross the threshold of a door 4, 5, 6 times, whatever the number is they're using. We can also see this with having to touch the door or the door frame so many times before they exit a room or enter a room. And another way we see this is touching objects in a room. So somebody will enter into a room and have to touch every piece of furniture 3 or 4 times, for example. Another counting ritual that's similar is looking at objects in a room or looking at something so many times. Now this is a compulsion because someone's moving their eyes and looking at something, but of course it also has kind of a mental compulsion feel to it as well, where they're counting internally as they're looking at different objects. So we see it with touching, with looking, and with movement. Another question I hear related to counting rituals is, does the number have to change? So if someone counts something so many times, like 5 times for example, is it always 5 times? Or can it be 10 times? Or is it 5 times for one type of counting and 15 times for another? Well, the answer is usually the number is constant. If it's 3 or 4, it's usually 3 or 4 for most everything. But I have seen instances where the number is different depending on what's being counted. I've also seen other types of situations where it's not exactly a certain number, like 5 or 6, but rather it has some sort of mathematical property. And the most common I see is a number has to be odd or even. Another example of this is the number has to be greater than a certain number. So rather than being precisely 5 times, it has to be at least 5 times that something's counted or something's checked. On rare occasions, I've seen the opposite, where the number has a maximum. So if somebody is counting something to say 9 times, and they count more than 9 times, they'll have to go back and count that less than 9 times. So it can be greater than a certain number or less than a certain number. As far as which numbers are most often represented, I've seen a lot of variety in these numbers. It seems like the numbers 3 through 10 are by far the most common. I'd say most of the counting rituals tend to fall between 3 and 10. However, I have seen examples where the number has been greater than 100. So it's easy to see how disruptive this particular obsession and the following compulsion could be, particularly as the numbers become very high. It's one thing to count something 4 times, that's certainly disruptive. It's another thing to count something 60 or 70 times. Now, counting rituals are, of course, tied to safety. They can also be tied to a particular type of safety called contamination. It's a fear of getting sick, a fear of germs. So one way we can see counting rituals tied to this would be using like a chemical spray, like a cleaner, and spraying so many times on a surface to make sure it's clean. So a lot of times with these obsessions, the different types of obsessions can be combined in different ways, and the counting ritual can work into a lot of those obsessions and compulsions. I hope you found this description of counting rituals with OCD to be interesting. Thanks for watching.